Good evening, everyone. Hello, good evening. Thank you all for being here. My name is Julie Crooks, and I am the Associate Curator of Photography here at the AGO. Thank you so much for braving the kind of inclement weather that we're having to listen to what I think will be a really enlightening conversation. And most importantly, thank you for the continued support of Black women, I was going to say here on the stage and not here yet, but your continued support of the Black women in this room and the two that will be on this stage soon. The AGO operates on land that is the territory of the Anishinaabe-Mississauga Nation and was also the territory of the Wendat and Haudenosaunee. The Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Toronto is also governed by a treaty between the federal government of Canada and the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe Nation. Toronto has always been a trading center for First Nations. Tonight's talk is held in conjunction with Sandra Brewster's AGO exhibition, Sandra Brewster Blur, presently showing in the Mary and Harry Jackman Gallery until March 2020. If you haven't seen this show, please do, and if you have, please, please encourage other folks to see it because it's quite an extraordinary exhibition. Sandra also has an exhibition, Town Girls Beneath, on view at YYZ Artists Outlet, which Canisia Lubrin has written about. I encourage you also to go and see this exhibition. Following their conversation, we'll have some time for audience questions. Canisia Lubrin is a writer, editor, critic, and teacher, published and anthologized internationally. Her work has been translated into Spanish and Italian. She's the author of the poetry collection Voodoo Hypothesis, named a CBC Best Book, and her next book, The Digraphits, I probably pronounced that incorrectly, Digraphits, will be published in March 2020. Lubrin is the 2019 Writer-in-Residence at Queen's University and poetry faculty at the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity for the 2019 Emerging Writers Intensive. Sandra Brewster is a Canadian visual artist based in Toronto and an icon, in my view. Her view has been exhibited nationally and internationally. A recipient of the Toronto Friends of the Visual Arts Artist Prize in 2018 and the Gattuso Prize for the Scotiabank CONTACT Photography Festival in 2017. Brewster has been recognized for her community-based practice that centers a Black presence located in Canada. The daughter of Guyanese-born parents, she's especially attuned, yeah, there was a clap. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Guyana represent. I'll repeat it. The daughter of Guyanese-born parents, she is especially attuned to the experiences of people of Caribbean heritage and their ongoing relationships with back home. She received a Master of Visual Studies degree from the University of Toronto. Brewster is represented by Georgia Sherman Projects. Please join me in welcoming warmly Sandra Brewster and Canisia Lubrin.
Good evening. It is my joy to welcome you all here tonight. And thank you so much, Jill, for the generous introductions. Sandra, it's a particular pleasure to be here speaking with you.
It's a pleasure for me to be here speaking with you, Canisia.
We can just compliment each other all night. I'm cool.
We can. I love your hat.
Thank you. Might borrow your glasses just to complete the look.
No problem.
On occasion of your residency, of course, and Sandra Brewster Blur. I mean, I'm here with you as someone who works primarily with the alphabet. So I wonder if we can start with your own history. What were those key moments in your life probably that led you to choose to work in the medium of visual artistic expression? Let's start there.
I don't think I have like a specific time when, I knew that I wanted to work in the arts, right? I come from a background of, my parents are kind of artistic. They have artistic sensibilities. Both of my mother, she, just their beings are very creative, right? My dad used to sketch. I remember I have pictures of myself in my dad's office sketching on his graph paper. He had like this graph paper that he used to, formulate, an outline of, the layout of the basement. We once lived in the basement where he renovated the basement. And so he was like, we'd do all these sketches and such. And my mother the same way. And my mom, she started a senior Guyanese association when she first came here in the late 60s. And, the whole organization is about arts and crafts and such. Back in Guyana, I know my family was part of the theater guild. And so I think I came from a family that really kind of spoke to the arts. And I also have an uncle, a second cousin actually, who's a visual artist. And he also lived with us. I'm just remembering all of this. He lived with us for a period of time. And there are stories of him and his friends coming over and he taking me on his shoulders and then putting me in the middle of their talks about politics and arts and such, and, Afro picking my hair. And so I don't know, maybe all of that got into me, and I started doing arts. But I don't think I can fix a period of time. I know I always used to draw, and I used to do a lot of artwork outside of school. My art teachers used to be mad that I wasn't doing that work inside of school. And I think as time went on, it was just about me kind of formulating my voice. As I know, Canisia, you talk about like, what is your voice, right? And so I find as time went on, that's what I was trying to do, just formulate why I do this visual thing.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting just to think about voice, especially when we're thinking of visual art, in specifically what we notice coming into an exhibition like Blur is the aesthetic of blurring those images, and it calls up a particular intervention in what we're witnessing. There's a way to enter that space to think of what is seen and how we see it, because really there's a suggestion of voice, right? Because we're in a silent medium, right? And so there's this blurring. Can you speak to that as your chosen aesthetic and what it's negotiating and what we're seeing and how?
Well, when I started the Blur, I have some images I can show you. When I started the Blur, I was not really thinking about, what was seen and what was not seen. What I was trying to do was go, well, I guess I was in a way, but what I was trying to do was go deeper, right? Deeper than the surface. And I was trying to do this through a kind of a bare bones type of method. So looking at how movement would conjure these kind of ideas around identity, and using movement in this direct relationship to the movement from one place to another place, the relationship between, my parents' movement from Guyana to Toronto. And so I had decided to ask people in my community to come to my studio and to move in front of the camera. So these are just images of the initial, pictures of people coming in and just in front of the camera at a low shutter speed. I'm taking images of them, and it's capturing that blur in their faces. After I took these images, I then transferred them onto paper. I tried to, do other methods like drawing and painting and such, but I found there was like this inconsistency from one piece to the next. So, in the transfer that I was practicing already in other canvases, I just decided to, again, think of it as a bare bones kind of method, just to use that medium in order to convey this movement, right? And see what would happen. Within that process, what happens, because of the limited amount of control I have over it, sometimes the surfaces are cracking or creasing. You know, there's like this change that is occurring within that movement from one place to the other place. And therefore, it's conjuring up all of these interpretations about what happens when you leave a home and you establish a new home somewhere else. At times, you know, you're picking up from where you're ending up in, you're leaving part of yourself somewhere else, and so many other things.
And those are quite powerful metaphoric suggestions of interior narratives being projected outward, and coming to think of place as a theme. So there's movement, certainly, but also the role that place plays in that movement. You talk about back home and here, and we're suggesting that there's a certain relationship between Canada and the Caribbean mostly, more specifically your Guyanese roots. When we're standing in front of those grids of blurs on the wall, they appear almost to vibrate if you stare at them long enough. So there's also this experience of something that is illusioned as movement. And so let's talk about the theme of movement then in that work in relation to, say, an exhibition like Town Girls Beneath, where there's a very clear philosophy of place involved in the movement that we're seeing. Speak to this a little bit more.
Well, Town Girls Beneath is a video that documents the so-called removal, but I usually talk about it as the sanding over and the painting over of a transfer I did for my thesis exhibition at U of T. So my thesis exhibition was called A Trace, Evidence of Time Past, and it included images of the Essequibo River, which is a river located in Guyana, transferred on frosted mylar, so it's like a plastic material that's quite light. It's quite light, and the way I've installed them, once you pass them, it slowly moves, it lightly moves. So I chose that material for that specific reason. So I transferred the Essequibo onto these mylars, the Essequibo being the river being used as a metaphor from, again, movement from one place to another place. Yeah, there's another reason, but I won't share. There's also this image of my family. It's called Town Girls. I call this Town Girls Atop the Hill. So they're images of my family, and they're sitting on top of a hill somewhere in the Caribbean. They're led by this guide. And I transferred it onto the wall because I'm bringing their experience into this gallery space in Canada, right, in Toronto. This jar is a jar of fruits, currants that are soaking in rum, and it's the ingredients for black cake. So I love this. I call this piece heirloom. So this is heirloom. So what I'm doing here is bringing in this object that, people who I do not usually find within these contemporary art spaces would be able to connect to very closely, right? So what I had intended on doing was bringing in this piece, and I knew that this would happen. Once people came into the place, they would start to discuss what's in that jar. Some people would not know, other people would know. And it's not only, folks who know telling people who don't know, but also folks who know and folks who know comparing their black cake to, My sister also makes black cake now. I don't know many people in my generation who make black cake. So I also think about it as this transferring of this tradition from one generation to the next. and also putting on this plinth in, under plexi and such, I'm kind of elevating the importance of this piece that for me radiates this energy that is so powerful, and it does bring, all of us together, like folks from the Caribbean together, despite the fact of it being, derived from this black pudding, this British black pudding, right? We've still been able to create something that just like brings us all together. That's heirloom. This other image is of the window in the corner. It's not a very good image of it, but this is what the actual image is. It's of it's a light box that I made out of an image that I had taken from a window in a house in Chicago. So when I was doing an internship in Chicago, I was looking through this window and thinking how beautiful the scene through this window was. And I had taken this image thinking maybe one day we'll do something with this image. As time passed by, I would sit by this window and make art or write or read or whatnot. And I would start hearing these noises through this window. And then when I started to do some research, I found out that, the window faced a neighborhood that, some bad things were happening. And so I related this window to a piece by Lorna Simpson called The Park. She has this series called Public Sex, in which she has taken images from overhead, the Central Park. And there's this density of trees and such, and beyond that, other things are happening beyond those trees. And so I just like this idea of, what we're seeing is not what we're actually seeing. There's something that's deeper, that's happening beyond. And that's how this piece kind of resonated with me. This is these are members of the Senior Guyanese Association, and they're going through my thesis paper, which was full of stories and anecdotes about Guyana. There are either stories that I'm retelling or memories that I have based on what I've been told. And so those are just some seniors going through the paper. And then this is the so-called removal of town girls atop the hill. I thought it would be important to document the painting of this piece, because when the show had to be taken down, there was a discussion I had with the gallery about how they would restore the gallery back to its former self. And I enjoyed the conversation because I would talk about it not having to be removed, and they would insist that it has to be removed. And so although I know that we were talking about the same thing, she telling me, we have to remove it by this date. I said, you don't have to remove it. All you have to do is sand it down and paint it over. So we would be going back and forth like that, but I loved the, the possible interpretations of this conversation. And so these are actually stills of the video Town Girls Beneath. That became Town Girls Beneath, right? So this is just, these are the installers who are sanding down the piece and then painting over it. No matter how much they also sand it down, the piece does not disappear, and then eventually they must paint over it. For me, this work is just about how, these town girls are actually not disappearing. They're not going anywhere. They'll always be within the architecture of the space, right? So, when I was thinking about it, before I had decided to document it and watching the whole documentation, watching them act on the wall, I thought, wow, yeah, they're here forever, really, Mm-hmm.
It's wonderful. And there's a very obvious or palpable use of metaphor and symbolism and storytelling in the work that you're doing. And you've talked about going beyond what's first visible, what's on the surface. And I'm thinking that, we're looking at the blurs, and there's also the sanding down of the town girls on the wall. Working with a lot of imperfection, creases, cracks, the holes in the sanding down. And really, this doesn't really as personally as one of your viewers, as, someone who takes in your work, I don't think of flaw at all, and I don't think of pathology. What I find in the presence of that is wonder and awe. And so I'm wondering, who are your main influences? What does your lineage look like?
Okay, well, first of all, I think that, can I just say something else? I just realized this looking at this image. I wanted to show this piece after, Town Girls Beneath, because I wanted to share that what happens to Town Girls Beneath is what's going to happen to this piece here, right? To this wall transfer here. And knowing this, not only with everything that I've said about legacy and permanence and such when it comes to these wall transfers, I had chosen this particular image to be transferred to the wall because of who the model represents, right? So I just wanted to share a little bit about this model. And at the opening, I had talked a little bit about it, but many people here were not there, so I'm going to just repeat it. So this person, her name is Tuku Matthews. She's a very good friend of mine, and she's also a singer and a performer in the city. Her sister is Saida Babataliba, who's now called Sate, right? I say her former name because many people don't know that her name has changed. Their parents are Salome Bey, who is a jazz singer here in Canada, and their father was Howard Matthews, and he was co-owner of the Underground Railroad, which was a restaurant that was located on King Street West. Saida, who is a singer, Sate, who is a singer, and Tuku were part of this band called Black Sam. And Black Sam was a band that was around during the 90s and really, truly influenced how I felt about myself within the city here in Toronto. The band also had Shannon Miracle in it, and Washington Savage was the lead of this band. And they were like brash and loud and quiet and cool. It was a merging of blues and rock and punk, and like all sorts of types of styles, and their fashion, they were just like really, really cool. And so they were totally cool. And so it just really helped me to, think about my place here, right? And they have also kind of, they were instrumental in the making and the thinking of a lot of people here in the city. Not only their parents, they're like a legacy for their parents, as well as the band that they're in has been influential and inspiring to us as well. So that's why I've used, Tuku as a model for this piece, knowing that Tuku is going to be embedded into the walls of the AGO forever. Now, in terms of my influences and such, I don't think I was the type of person who was following particular kinds of artists, right? And said, okay, this is how I make because of these types of artists. But I just wanted to go quickly through, many experiences and maybe people who have influenced throughout the time, right? So, oh my goodness. I was just about to just wing it, but I think I have to just look quickly.
Back to your notes.
To a few notes here, because I knew you would ask me this question, and I just wanted to make sure, because there's so many. So I remember when I was quite young, my Aunt Pauline Bullen, she had wanted me to, at least be aware of some people in the city who were doing creative works, right? So those were people like Claire Prato, who's a filmmaker, Dion Brand, who is, Dion Brand, writer. Grace Channer, artist Grace Channer. Winsome, who had, a solo exhibition here in the same space, in the space beside mine on the second floor. Faith Noland, oh my gosh, Faith Noland, who is grassroots activist, wonderful musician. And so I had to know these people, right? I also knew of June Clark, who also had an exhibition in the same space where I'm in now, a solo exhibition. And I knew of the Sage Bailey, but I had never met her, and I haven't even met her to this day. When I started my BFA at York, I became friends with Roseanne Bailey, and Roseanne had started getting me to, organize exhibitions and such for African Liberation Month shows in the Student Center. And this was essential because it got me out of this kind of solitude space in the arts program at York. And it had me going out to different parts of the city in order to get artists to come in to show at York. And so I really, I really treasure, or I really appreciate the fact that she had, she pushed me in that way. At York, I had also encountered Tim Whiten, and I was so curious about him because he was like the only black artist who I knew who did not, create work that was about, capital B, black, capital I identity, right? His work was more so about, the spirit and, the spirit and energies and, all of these intangible things. And he was so close to, and he also was very concerned with how materiality was able to express these ideas that he had. I was really kind of in awe of Tim Whiten, actually. After school, I went to South Africa, and I stayed a year there, and I encountered so many artists who, despite the residue of apartheid, were very insistent on being exhibited and I don't know what the word, presented in ways that, other white artists were being shown, right? So they insisted on being part of catalogs. They wanted proper representation. They wanted to be in the galleries, have their work presented properly. And so, that kind of energy was really interesting to me because I knew back home in Toronto, there was a lot of challenges happening. And when I had returned back home, I was full of that energy and found, oh, wow, it's really challenging here, right? But knowing in my mind there was a way that you do have to demand, right? You do have to demand how you want to be presented. And truly, when I was in South Africa, I learned a lot of that from the artists there. When I returned to Toronto, Natalie Wood, she encouraged me to join A-Space and be on the board there. Being on the board there meant I learned a lot about, the workings of the art world in the city. I learned about other artists here and who was engaged with and who was not engaged with. And then I had a first solo show at a small, modest gallery called Jaja that Andrew Harwood had, I love Andrew Harwood. Andrew Harwood, he was actually the president of A-Space's board at the time, and he invited me to do an exhibition there. That exhibition was called Cool Pose, and these are some of the images of Cool Pose. So they were portraits of artists who I was on a residency with in Winnipeg. The residency was called The Last Stop, to reference the last stop of the Underground Railroad, and some of the artists on the residency were in that series. This is not one of them, this is not one of the artists, but the artists who were on the residency was Wayne Dunkley, Gomo George, and Jan Wade was on that residency as well. So these are just some of the pieces. I remember when the show was up, I was so nervous about the opening, and the place was packed. And I know the space was really small, but it was great to see all of these black folks in this space and spilling out onto the street. And then what happened was, it was kind of curious for me. There was this writer who was there, and he said to me, Sandra, this show is so great. I'm going to write about this show. And I thought, great, finally. Because believe it or not, way back then, in 2002, we were still talking about not having writers who are writing about our work. Although we talk about that now, is my point. So anyway, so this writer, when he had said that, I thought, okay, great, this is going to happen, this is great. I'm thinking, something will happen after that. But then the writing never came. And then I thought to myself, wow, we really have to do a lot of this, on our own, right? And so my life ended up being a lot of organizing, as well as making work, as well as working in order to make a living, right? So that was my life. And a part of that was, doing open house. So open house was an exhibition that I had outside of my home. I did that for 3 years. It only lasted a week each time. But the first year I had like 15, 16 people. The second year, the same amount. And the third year, I had about 26 artists who showed throughout the house. And there were like 500 people who came through the house. My sister and I were like, what's going on here? But it was a great community experience. And then it kind of filtered into, the art world. A lot of directors and gallerists came in, and curators and writers, and all sorts of people came in. And so the whole point was to show, who are the other artists who are showing in the city. The whole idea of open house was a response to the area in which I was living. It was the Junction Triangle area, and they were having a lot of, art activities happening in that area to enliven that area, but there were never any, artists of color in these shows. And so open house is just open house, and then when you get there, it's like majority are black artists and then our friends, right? There was no any subheading or anything like that. We centered who we were, right? So that was what open house was. In terms of artists, though, sorry. When going to school, there were I was influenced by, art history, the canon and such. I'm going to say 3 names, which people who may have nothing to do with each other, but I really love Caravaggio and Chuck Close. I love Chuck Close, portraits, the first portrait work. And I really love Cindy Sherman because I felt that she had a lot of gall, right? And I also remember that she had made this statement about, because she used to paint, but she stopped painting and put herself in these photographs. And I remember her making this statement saying that, painting just had her take too long to get to where she wanted to be. And so she just started, taking photos. I thought, whoa, this woman, she just do that, right? And then Basquiat, of course, was the only black artist we learned about. But of course, I love Basquiat. On my own, I did research into the Harlem Renaissance and really connected with Charles White. I'm sorry, Canisia, I'm not letting you talk.
We're here to hear you talk.
Okay, I hope so. And a friend had told me about Roy DeCarva, right? And Roy DeCarva I love to this day, obviously, for, this way that he embodies blackness within the materiality of these photographs he makes. Roy DeCarva was a wonderful photographer. Thelma Golden, the work of curator Thelma Golden, had me becoming more and more aware of these African American artists through the Studio Museum, and also feeling like I'm close to something that is happening, right? And so some of these artists I would continue to follow. Sometimes I don't like them anymore. I became close to loving Lorna Simpson, and my absolute love is Carol Walker, right? And I remember when Carol Walker was actually here, and she was doing a talk here, and she was being challenged by this young woman who was asking her about the provocative nature of her silhouettes, and she had told the woman, the answer is in the work. And I thought, you go, girl. But then when I think about, when you really think about that, right, it's who that person is going to resonate through the actual work that they're making. And there's a reason why visual artists make. And so you can almost, in some cases, presume or assume what they're going to feel in certain ways. Why would Carol Walker create the silhouettes that she does, right? And for me, personally, I like the fact that she's creating these silhouettes that are almost like voids. And at the same time, it's so potent. There's so much within these empty things, these empty figures, right? And I just don't want to end without, talking about, a few local artists who, when I was a younger artist, I would always, look to. Like Michael Chambers, for me, Oh my God, talking about embodying beauty within Blackness, this was Michael Chambers to me. He absolutely created photographs where we can feel like there's nothing else being, I'm getting all emotional about Michael. But, he put us, on this beautiful pedestal through, the compositions and the care of the craft of analog photography. I also would always look to the persistence that Deanna Bowen and Camille Turner have in their practice, and the fact that they are mining the histories of Blackness within Canada, and then showing us, look at what they're either saying to us, or we are going to correct this history for you, right? Deanna and Camille, I absolutely respect as artists, and I think they take up so much wonderful space. Camille Turner crowned herself Miss Canadiana, like that for me is an ultimate thing. I'm also very, when it comes to materiality, I'm also very attracted to old film formats. I love old photography. I like Super 8. I like the feel and the texture of old photographs. And so I think that when I started the Blur, I had all of this in me, and even when I think about the gathering that had begun, the whole series, it was within that nature of, appreciating what has come before, community of family and family that has always been around me.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a profoundly rich and varied history or influence or really wide field of material that you're pulling from. And thinking of why an artist chooses to make the art that they make, I wonder if we can talk a little bit about space as an archive or place as an archive, because look at all of what you're holding. You called up earlier the basement that your parents used to live in, South Africa, the school, different places, and you're holding so much. So talk a little bit about Space's archive and what is being imagined for you through the method of the gel overlay.
Oh boy, I don't even know how to realize. But when you say that, though, I just remember when I was doing the residency here, and I would go into the photo department, and they talk about how they are documenting the work in the gallery, and then I considered how, among in our own homes, we cherish certain objects, right? That we keep them, we cherish them. Like I have this pointer broom that I just have hung up in my kitchen, and I've never used that broom ever. But it's like something, and there's no reason for me to ever use that broom. Like I wasn't born in Guyana or anything, but I know the stories that are connected to that broom and such. Huh?
You don't have a dirt yard.
No, I don't have a dirt yard to use a pointer broom in, right? But it's things like this, and I had done a series called Token that was around that whole idea of, having these objects and cherishing them, and just observing how the institution makes sure that nobody forgets that these pieces have existed, or even the context in which they did. It made me think of, the objects that we also have as well. And so, I don't know if that's if that is sufficient.
That's plenty. And then so with the gel with the gel overlay, that whole method, you're holding something clearly. Because you just said you're going to have your friend in the wall of the AGO forever, and then we have your aunts over at YYZ forever, and not YYZ, but the previous exhibition space. You're obviously holding on to a lot when you do that.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about beauty.
But I think too, with this, with the gel transfer as well, with the quality of them, I think, it just being there and still existing within our presence similar to old photographs, regardless of the condition of them, we still have this want to keep them, right? I have old photographs that are like all mash up, and I will still keep these photographs regardless of anything because of what is depicted in them. And then sometimes just the object itself seems so precious that I don't want to throw them away.
Yeah. If I come to your house, will there be gel overlays on the walls? Or
No, Canisia.
No. I'm so disappointed.
No gel.
I would. All right. Well, maybe you can come put one up in my living room.
No problem.
You better start raising funds. Let's talk about beauty, though. How do you hold beauty in something like, an exhibition like Blur? Let's talk about beauty, because it almost seems like a given when we're talking about a visual medium, photographs, etc. It's almost like a thing we take for granted, right? But let's talk about Blur and beauty.
I think in these pieces, I'm using Blur as like this strategy to draw people in, right? I have people move in a certain way. I know the Blur will have a certain kind of gesture to it. And because, too, you cannot totally fix what is in front of you, it makes people sometimes, it draws people in, right? So I think that I know that these are typically beautiful images, and it's a way of bringing people into the work and having them stay and ponder and think about what they're looking at. I also think that it's, because there's creases and folds and such, these are things that are not necessarily considered beautiful, right? But then I think what it's doing is adding complexity to whatever the image is that you're looking at. So it's suggesting that beauty is more so than an aesthetic thing, like something that you're seeing on the surface. I'm hoping that people are engaged with it on a deeper level.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
And if we move away from the images up on the walls and we turn our attention, I don't know, maybe everyone has already been to the exhibition, I hope so. There is the moving image, the picture, the video that is part of the exhibition. There are symbolic gestures sort of embedded in the movie, right, which is basically of Black folk in their everyday lives, simply carrying on living in the city as this sort of geopsychic space. We see a Black man in the backseat of a car smiling, just owning the conditions of that smile. A Black girl on her cell phone, the TTC moving about in the background, a man walking with a pregnant grocery bag. Black folk just carrying on and living. And really this just calls up, again, one's relationship to place, but also how time affords us a certain either clarity in hindsight or something else. So what do you think is the work of time for you in that sort of visual space, especially in that video exhibition?
When I had decided to do this piece called Walk On By, I had wanted to create it with a Super 8 camera in order for this mashup of time between the quality of the Super 8 as well as the contemporary images that it would be capturing. I wanted it to be like this mashup, right? And so the idea was to suggest that these folks, although you can tell that they are from the now, that there's something about them that has been here for a very, very long time. Yeah. I don't know if I could.
Yeah. It's beautiful. I was really.
And I really
struck
like
by
your setup for the
whole setup for it.
the
All right.
discussion of what you see and such like that. Thank you for that.
No, truly, it was a really unexpected thing for me coming into the exhibition and then coming coming up against that. And I
And some-
stood there for a good long while just looking at it on loop, because it demands that kind of attention.
In some ways, I was, I would play with the zoom and such, and I was intending on, I'm remembering because I'm looking at this piece too, this image of it too, that I was trying to, to make the person in it as well as the background to kind of blend, right? I wanted it to blend together so that, the person's kind of blending into the landscape, right? So it's just suggesting of like this rootedness that we have here in this space. Yeah.
Beautiful. So thinking in relation to the stills, the moving images, I wonder if you work with other art forms at all. Does other art forms factor into the work that you're doing, your process, etc.?
I have no time to work with any other. That's not true. No. I always wish that I was into music because my dad, he played guitar, harmonica, and piano. I don't play music, but I really love music, and I find that at times I think with the gel transfer, in the whole practice of doing it, it has like a rhythm to the whole thing. Like the second half of the process of the gel transfer is the washing off of the paper. And in so doing, I have to just be rubbing this paper back and forth, and it does create some kind of rhythm in the whole movement of, removing the paper from the wall. But I used to, and it also kind of reminds me of when I would listen to, Fela and Miles Davis, their long, prolonged melodic music while I was creating work. But that's as far as I can go.
Do you document yourself at all when you work?
No.
No.
When we had done the piece here at AGO, we did some documentation of that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was going to suggest that maybe a music artist out there can sample you on a track.
That would be interesting.
Doing the,
Cool.
yeah? Come now. Holla.
Ah!
So, I mean, this might be a really good place to speak more broadly about the visual art world in Canada, in the country. If you can comment briefly on what your own definition of artistic freedom actually means for you, and if you have any insights into the broader world of visual arts, what's going on in the industry in the country that we should know about, that we may not know about.
Yeah. I think right now there is this kind of agenda that's being driven throughout the country when it comes to what is necessary in order to be acknowledged as a visual art, an artist. Like what subject matter is acknowledged as legitimate subject matter in art. And I think a lot of artists are trying to, in some ways, they're trying to kind of latch on to elements of that, right? I think that people should be able to make whatever they want, right? And I think that they should focus on their practice, they should open themselves up to critique, do studio visits with people, and find their voice that way and play that way, right? I think that when I'm looking at, how I make work, and I'm looking at the subject matter that I work with from the past and even, at present, I'm very curious at times at what I see as like a default kind of interpretation with some of the work. The intention that I have, I understand when you put it out there, people have their interpretations, but the interpretation is always interesting to me when it defaults to a centering of something, that the work is very much decentering. I also find too that even I'm thinking about myself and how I talk about the work. If I'm saying I'm decentering, am I centering when I'm saying I'm decentering? It's absolutely confusing, right? But I think at the same time I'm comfortable And I think I've gotten to this point where I'm comfortable with the choices that I'm making in my work. I'm comfortable with the choices that I'm making, in my practice, with whom I work. There was a time when I used to think that I'd have to say yes to everything, and now I'm more discerning about, what I will participate in, who I will work with, and such. And and if I make mistakes, I forgive myself. But I'm just more comfortable, I think, where I'm at right now. And at the same time, I'm also pondering all of those things about the centering and the decentering and such. Yeah.
And it's really interesting, actually, to think of a time when you were not as comfortable as you are now, and how that influenced the kind of work that you did. And I'm always very interested about, artists' relationship with doubt, right? And the kinds of things that can do, because I actually value doubt. I think it's important.
I think it is.
So in that broader sense of what's happening in the industry, that maybe what we should be paying attention to in terms of artists that are out there and creating some stuff.
Yeah, I think that, I think basically people should just take advantage of what is going on out in the city. Right now we have, a festival that's happening through the Biennale. We have Nuit Blanche that's coming up. Jelani Morgan has a great show at the Doris McCarthy Gallery at Scarborough, Scarborough campus, U of T. Esma Mahmood is showing in Museum London. I think it's important for us to kind of get out of the city to see works by artists elsewhere. Rajni Pereira has a great show at Division. Deanna Bowen has a wonderful show at Art Museum, where she again is doing a lot of mining, a lot of mining for us. I think in general, people should just go out to see what the shows are. And what I really, really wish is that people would put their names on, this is such a weird thing to request, but people to put their names on, the email lists of a lot of these galleries so that they know what is happening, so that these things will come straight to their inbox. As an artist who is trying to show in different spaces and such, a part of it is because it has been, I remember being in school and being one of the only artists, one of the only Black artists there, and really always wanting to see, my community in the spaces in which I was working, considering the work is essentially for and about my community, right? And so it becomes even more so it's a task, it's a loving task. So it's not like I'm complaining or anything like that. But on top of creating the work and getting it out there, artists are also promoting themselves with the hopes of getting certain people to come and to see what they're doing, right? So I think in general, it's just a great idea to engage with what's going on in the city, because you never know what's going to pop up,
And because we can posit that there's something that visual art does in the world that no other art form will do, right? In your words, if you could put it in a sentence, what do you think that thing is? Because clearly it's important work.
Imagine, not being able to put words to something. It's that potent. That's what I think visual arts does.
Phenomenal. Now, thinking of that, what is under control for you? Because here we are, we're sitting in the presence of an immense thing that you cannot put words to. But here it is, and it's alive and it's pulsing in front of you. What is under control for you when you approach a new work, and what is not under control?
Well, I can talk about it in terms of the gel transfer.
Yeah, let's talk about the gels.
But then I discovered something a little bit a while ago, because I talk about control when it comes to the gel transfer. I talk about how I have control in the initial process. So I take the image of the person, I scale the image, so I'm doing all of this digital work at the beginning of the process. Then I print off these images. This is all controlled, right? So there may be minor things that I don't have control over, but basically it's all in control. The second part of the process is adhering the image to the surface. So in the case of the wall transfers, I printed out these large panels. Then I add a gel medium to the paper. I add it also to the wall, and I'm taking these large pieces of paper, and I am adhering them to the wall. There's limited amount of control because the thing is so big, and I'm here managing everything. And I'm hoping as well that there's enough gel medium to transfer sufficient amount of ink from the paper onto the surface that I'm working on. When I wash off the paper after the whole thing dries, I am not absolutely sure of what is to come. So it's always like a nerve-wracking process for me every single time I'm doing these pieces, because I'm not sure if enough ink has adhered. I don't know if there'll be too many creases and such, and if the image will not give the impression that I want it to be. I need it to be decipherable, right? So those are the different areas of control and lack of control or limited amount of control. However, I was thinking the other day, with the whole initial process, when I did the first series of blurs, I had people come into the studio and I had to ask them to, perform for me in front of the camera. And that was another experience for me, totally, because I didn't think it was going to be, it was emotional in some ways, and it was difficult in other ways. The worst model for me was an actor who was very bad at being directed. But also there were other people who were actually exposing their vulnerabilities, right? And then it became about my relationship with this person in front of me. These are things that I cannot control, And I think it's deeper than the blur. It's something else that I have been trying to think about. How do I get a grasp on that, or whether I really have to? But anyway, I was just thinking about that the other day, about how that initial part of the whole process, before I even begin to do the artwork, is something that I may have no control over. And it's about, the relationship between us, right? Yeah.
And speaking of those relationships then, since thematically a lot of your work is about diaspora, in this particular Caribbean diaspora, and you grapple a lot with those ideas, why do you think that's important today, especially given everything that's going on in the world? Why do you think that's important?
I think it's important to me because of, I'm always looking for true representations of people, right? And I think within this idea of the blur, I am trying to look for it in not a typical way of just a portrait. I'm trying to look beyond that surface to find what is really and truly happening. And I find this sense of identity that encompasses this, these different kind of locations and these different time periods. It's a legitimate sense of identity that I find not only in myself, but also in many people who have similar experiences that I do. And I think that, it's just like something that is not really, it hasn't, what I've seen, hasn't been taken on. It's not taken seriously or recognized or acknowledged and such.
And is there an urgency for you? What are you in conversation with? Is there something happening in the world that you're responding to? What is the thing that's feeding? What's the conduction happening in the work?
I think, oh my goodness, Canisia. What is the urgency? There are a lot of things happening in this world that makes the idea of diaspora very important, right? there is a movement of people in this world that's forced, or that even if, like in my parents' situation, they had to move from Guyana to here because the back home was just not for them livable. They were trying to make a future that would be better for themselves as well as people who they had not even given birth to yet, right? So when people do this, it's a serious thing, right? And so upon that movement, the result of that movement is a person who is contributing to a new place. And when I see that this is not being acknowledged, taken on, when you see the challenges that people face in a new place, regardless of the contributions that they give to that place, it's unfair, and it's just not right. These words, not fair, unright. But I think for me, it's always been like that, in which it's always been something that I've kind of observed, and then my whole process is to bring attention to, that identity.
Relatedly, the Trinidadian photographer, artist, academic Kevin Adonis Brown, who wrote the book High Mass, where he uses photography and poetry and essays in this sort of really cool engagement with mass culture, the culture of mass and carnival, He says, the quote in there is, "Empire is a camera." And it's really interesting to think of that idea in terms of the blurs, because you're working with photo-based gel transfers. Why did you choose to work particularly with photographs and not painting, drawing, or some other kind of method? What is it particular to the photograph for you in here to do that work?
Well, the work that I'm creating it is photo-based. It's not photographs, right? Okay. Like you're saying. And what I think what I'm doing is, when I take the photograph, I do begin with taking a photograph, but then I kind of wreck it, right? Because I transfer it onto another surface, and I don't treat it with the same preciousness that I see photographers that I'm aware of or I've experienced treat photographs. So I'm kind of denying the process in a way, And I think it also relates to the people who are being exposed in the photograph. For me, they are too complex to be put in a frame anyway, right? This is why they're moving. This is why you can't decipher exactly who they are, right? So I'm kind of denying all of these things. That's what I'm doing.
Brilliant. So we're at a point here where all of us, and I can read minds so I can see everybody thinking about exactly what I'm thinking about. We're thinking of
dinner. I was just joking.
Yes. My goodness, we are hungry. We're thinking of younger Sandra Brewster. And we're also thinking of all the artists who are coming up who have dreams of doing the things that you're doing. What would you say right now to younger Sandra Brewster, or to those budding artists amongst us? What would you say? Do you have anything to say to them?
I always find difficulty with this question because, oh my gosh, it's so complex. And then also the road to doing a practice in the arts is, like, every single artist I know, they have their own individual way in which they go about what they do. And there are so many outside influences that will affect that journey, right? I think first and foremost, play is important. Play with it. And I could be wrong. Okay, what I'm saying is just what I'm thinking, but I could totally be wrong. But I think play is important, playing with materials, with ideas, with, what is it I'm trying to say. play is important. I think it's important to be open to critique, and it's important to ask questions of people. To be open to critique. That is very important. It's important to engage with your artistic community. I'm looking at people, is that right? Is that right? But I think that is also very important. No matter who these artists are who are exhibiting in spaces and in places, whether they're here or elsewhere, it is very important to engage with the work that they do. If it's galleries that you're interested in, it's important to go and check out what these galleries are and the work and how work is exhibited, and to educate yourself in that way, in whatever way. It's important to take advantage of the artists who you relate to, who are out there, right? And to attempt to be in contact with them. Sometimes you're unable to be in contact with them because they're trying to, focus on their practice. But I think it's important to, to take advantage of their presence, and also learn from their wins and also their failures. Right? There's so many other things I could say, but I think...
Well, those are great.
I hope so.
Yeah, that's a really great place to break into
so.
the part of the night where we take your questions. If anybody has questions for Sandra, I see a hand going up over there. And here.
Hey, Sandra.
Hi.
Coleman.
Coleman.
I just want to say I appreciate the foregrounding, like say this image, these images that you're showing of the material transfers. Because for me, like when I encounter the images, it's not so much that the image that you're creating creates for me this apprehension of an interstitiality, like a space between the material and the subject. And that space opens itself up for my projections, for my interpretations, for my understanding around the politic of the work. So at one point I wondered, I said, oh, in this space is a politic, it's also an anti-nostalgia stance, it feels like to me, because it's not imbued with just a passive representation. For me, it's an active space for inviting me into myself. So I just wanted to ask, how do you relate to nostalgia in your work?
I think, how do I relate to nostalgia? I grew up in a family that is very nostalgic. And I think that, Guyanese folks are known to be very nostalgic because they left Guyana, although they love Guyana very much, right? I think that other Guyanese folks here can relate to a family that always talks about, back in the day, botanical gardens, Kaichur Falls, what is it called, the water place? There were so many things, the seawall, the seed wall, the wooden church. My mom also always talks about the wooden church. And so but the thing is, they've never gone back. Many Guyanese people don't go back to Guyana, but all we do is hear about all of these stories about Guyana, the way it used to be, how it was so beautiful. It was, the botanical gardens was like lush, and Guyana was, the most intelligent place in all of the Caribbean. And, so, anyway, it was all the, we're good in English, but it was always these kind of stories of back then that made Guyana like this potent place of like intelligent, beautiful people and beautiful landscape and everything like that. So, it's not true, And I think that a lot of people don't go back to Guyana because they're scared of seeing the opposite, right? And over time, Guyana has been increasingly not what they remember it as being, right? So I remember when I had gone to Guyana, I had all these things in my head, these places that I wanted to see, even people I wanted to meet because of all these stories that I was told. And I had done actually a series of these transfers. I took photographs when I was there, then did a series of transfers because I knew the transfers come out in a fractured kind of way to show that this is, these are kind of like false memories, or this is just, it's not absolutely as crisp, right? So that's my relationship with nostalgia. Yeah. Hi, Francisco.
Hang on, we're going to get to you.
Hi, my name's Renee, by the way. Good conversation. I love your art.
Thanks.
To play off with nostalgia, the last question, I was wondering, do you think nostalgia can be somewhat political? If so, how, sorry, I'm just going to say the second question off the back. If so, do you think it's important for artists to get political with their art?
Oh. I think, oh gosh, that's an interesting question. But I think that artists should be able to, express how they want to express, right? But I think for me, the most interesting work is work that is expressing something of an urgency of today. That's the work that I am more so connected to, right? Whether that's political, I don't know about that word political, but I think that, I think it's important to create work that people will connect to. I don't know if this is answering the question. But I don't think that people should feel that they have to create political work. However, I think that work that reflects the times that we are in it shows us some kind of engagement that the artist is doing with their surroundings.
Hi. I guess still it's somehow related to the idea of nostalgia, but also to the question about why, well, these are not photographs, but are photo-based works. I'm wondering, a way that I have always thought about your work is that there's something, or this more recent work, which is photo-based, that there's something about the trace, even if it's not photographic, that seems to me to be, these are not just any kind of representation, they're also, via the photographic, somehow traces. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you look at them like that, or if this is a misreading that I've always also projected onto your work.
Well, I think that, my thesis show is called A Trace, right? The work, I see them as traces as well. And so, and I relate them to, to time, right? So I think of them as, they are photo-based gel transfers. I also think of them as imprints of printmaking in a way, which are also, an element of a trace. So I agree with you. I think they are traces, and I think it's related to time. Mhm.
Thanks. Hi.
Hi.
How do you know, or how do you decide what your next project or series will be?
I know, or I decide based on the play that I'm doing with the current work that I'm working at. For example, when I had decided to do Town Girls Beneath, which is the video that's showing at YYZ right now, that's the documentation of the removal of the transfer that was in the thesis show. So Town Girls Beneath is a video work that is separate from that series, but it jumps off of that series, right? To get to these transfers that I'm doing now, I had gone through a whole series of work that included these characters that I made called the Smiths. The Smiths are these Afro-headed characters with the Smith section of the phone book replacing their faces. At first, I used to collage them. I used to cut and paste paper, and then I started to transfer the phone book into these characters. Then I started to transfer large images of people among these grids of these Smiths, and then now I'm, bare bonesing it and creating these only transfers, but now these images that appear to be moving from one place to another place just by their posture are not actually moving. So for me, it's about, something that continues from what I am doing now. But I think it all happens within the play that one can do within a studio space or with materials that you're working at. Yeah?
Okay, we'll do one last question. If you could pass the mic.
Hi, Sandra. Thank you for a
Hi, Dot.
fantastic talk and fantastic conversation. Thank you both. I'm really struck by I want to talk a little bit about the grid work, and I'm really struck about a kind of genealogy here and then what happens to it. And I'm thinking of Arnold Mogg's grid work, where it's all these fixed people. And then I'm thinking of Susie Lake's grid work, which has this kind of relationship to Cindy Sherman. And they're these very kind of fixed into time and space portraits. And then you have this grid work where it's a grid, but everything's blurring. It's like it's eluding. It's eluding our gaze in some way, and that really fascinates me. And I'm just wondering, in relationship to that move towards eluding rather than fixing, if you can speak a little bit about whether your work also kind of falls into the way Eve Tuck is thinking about haunting as that kind of material base of a kind of colonialism, that it's always there. And I don't know whether there's any relationship, but I was just wondering, does your work have anything to do with haunting?
With haunting.
With haunting.
I don't know. I think that, in regards to the grid, when I initially started doing work with the grid, it was to how to counter this idea of the grid that you had mentioned. So the grid is known to fix things. It's like a modern art kind of symbol of fixing things. The people within it are unfixing it by moving. When I think about the grid in these transfers, I think of it as our space, as my space, and people who are represented in it as their space, right? And when I see it in the space at the AGO when we had the opening, it brought great joy to me to see people going in and finding themselves within the grid and taking images of it and such, because they found themselves within our space, right? And it also brought me back to the time when I had gathered everybody to create the blurs to begin with. And I remember having that feeling at the opening when people would come in and look at this grid and find themselves. It just brought me back to that beginning. So I don't know about haunting, but I know that it's countering something that, you know, has been considered like the thing that is, you know, that has been, I don't know, valued as like a way of being within the art world. Mm-hmm. Interesting. So yes. So that's exactly what I said. Answers your question perfectly.
Sandra Brewster.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for coming out.
Thank you. Thank you.